Hello friends, welcome back to Study IQ. Let's continue our discussion of NCERT Science series. You already know we are discussing science textbook for NCERT class 9 where we are doing a chapter by chapter analysis. In our previous discussions, we discussed about some important concepts connected to chemistry. In the first 4 chapters, we focused on the idea of matter. We discussed that matter consists of tiny particles and we name them as atoms. In our subsequent discussions, we also understood about atoms and molecules, about atomic number, about mass number. All these things were discussed. And in the last discussion, we focused on chapter 5, the fundamental unit of life, where we entered into the domain of biology. What is the fundamental unit of life? We understood it as cell. For a unicellular organism, a single cell represents entire life. For a multicellular organism like humans, cell is a building block of our body. We understood cell and its different organelles along with its functions. We also focused on understanding the concept of cell division, that is mitosis and meiosis. In today's discussion, we'll move ahead and discuss chapter 6, which is connected to tissues. Again, a discussion related to biology. Now, this chapter 6 is going to be discussed in 2 parts. Today's discussion would be part 1. And as you know, tissues means we are going to focus on multicellular organisms. And here we are going to discuss 2 important themes. In today's discussion, in part 1, we are going to focus on plant tissues. And in our subsequent discussion, we will talk about tissues which are connected with animals. Here we'll talk about specific tissues that we find in our own body. All right. So today's discussion is part 1, plant tissues. Let's begin our interaction. But before that, if you're preparing for UPSC Civil Services examination, then there is a notice for you. Study IQ's first English batch, comprehensive prelims to interview batch, it is starting from 19th of June. Make a note on your calendar for 19th June. This is going to be life-changing for you because it's the beginning of our most comprehensive batch in English, where we will be hand-holding you from prelims till your interview. If you have enrolled, it's very good. I'll see you in the class. But if you have not enrolled, or if you know anybody who is looking for UPSC Civil Services preparation, please spread the word. Study IQ's comprehensive program is beginning from June 19th. It is quite affordable. If you want heaviest discounts on that, do use my code Rahul Live. Just visit our website www.studyiq.com. You'll get all the information about the features of this program. If you clear your prelims, then the mains residential program and its expenses would be taken care of by Study IQ itself. See you soon. Right, let's begin our discussion. As I told you, our interaction today is about tissues. In our previous discussions in class 6, 7, 8, and now also in 9th, we have understood the fundamental and the structural unit of life is cell. And I told you, for unicellular organisms, a single cell represents entire life. But for multicellular organisms, they are composed of group of cells. Our body is made up of billions of cells. And when these cells or some cells, they combine to perform some sort of a specific function, we call it tissue. Now, this is the basic organization of a multicellular organism. When we talk about plants or animals, different cells, they combine to perform some specific task or some specialization. We call them tissue. Tissues move into an advanced structure called as organ, and then these organs, they make our entire organ system, that is human body. And in our previous lectures, when we discussed in 7th standard, 8th standard, we spoke about some organ systems. We discussed about digestive system, circulatory system. Those are all made up of different organs. So this is the organization or levels of organization. From a cell, we move towards a tissue. From tissue, we move towards organ, and organ in a system, it runs your metabolic system or metabolic activity. For humans, there are different kinds of systems. For plants, there are different kinds of systems. Plants undergo photosynthesis. Now, we perform different metabolic activities. So, today's discussion is about this particular stage, tissue. First things first, what is the meaning of tissue? As I told you, cell is a structural and a functional unit of life. Here, discussion is connected to multicellular organisms. Different cells, when they perform one specific function together, it is called as a tissue. You can see here the definition, a group of cells that are similar in structure and work together to achieve a particular function in a multicellular organism, that is called as a tissue. For instance, our skin. Skin is a kind of a tissue. Skin is composed of millions of cells. That is why I find a layer, and this layer performs certain specific functions. It is some kind of an innate immunity model in our body, meaning it does not allow external particulate matter or external stuff to enter into our body. It helps in secretion. It acts as sweat gland. Basically, sweat glands release sweat. Right now, I'm sweating a little. The sweat here is coming through the skin itself, through the pores. So cells combine to form a tissue to perform specific function. Tissues together, they become organ, and then our body runs as an organ system, a composition of different organ systems. Right? That's the basic idea of tissue. Now, the question is, do multicellular organisms, when I talk about multicellular, we will focus on plants and animals. Of course, when we talk about bacteria or any other unicellular organisms, they do not have these complexities like tissues. Yes, we might find them in a colony. For example, fungi are found in a colony. Bacteria can also be found in colonies, but very seldom do we find them as multicellular organisms or multicellular entities. That is why our discussion is connected to plants and animals. The question here is, when I said tissue, do I find similar kind of tissues in plants and animals? Of course not, right? Why? Because the characteristics of these two organisms is completely different. You know, plants are stationary. You know, plants are autotrophs. Animals are not stationary. Animals are mobile, and animals are heterotrophs. They look or search for food. So their tissue structure is also based on these characteristics. That's why when we look at a plant tissue is organized in such a way that it helps towards the stationary habit of plants. Meaning, the tissue is not going to help the plant in movement. For instance, in our body, right now I'm moving. I'm doing some sort of gestures. Why? Because I have muscles. Muscles always work in a pair and they help in my mobility. But I do not find muscular tissue in plants. I do find muscular tissue in humans, animals, yes. But muscular tissue are not required in a plant. So in a plant, we find tissues which strengthen or which help in this stationary habit. For animals, they work for mobility. For example, muscular tissues. And that is why the organization of plant is rather simple. The tissues that we find in plants are again simple. More complex kind of tissues are found in animals. And when we look at plants, since they are stationary, they need protection. They need protection from wind, they need protection from other environmental factors. And that is why their tissues are, many of their tissues are dead. For example, the bark on the tree. You must have seen that the bark on the stem of a tree is very hard. Those are composed of dead tissues. That means dead cell, they make up dead tissues for protection. The same thing does not apply to animals. In animals, most of the tissues are living. Yes, some of the tissues, they might not have life. Yes, some of the tissues may be dead, some of the cells may be dead, some of the cells may be simply proteinaceous or some sort of chemicals, but majority of the tissues are living. Apart from that, in plant, the tissues are responsible for growth, and growth is confined in certain areas. But in animals, it is not the case. The growth is not limited only to some areas. And also, please remember, the tissues in plant, they grow continuously throughout their lifetime. They continuously grow. But in humans, in animals, it is not the case. As soon as maturity level is reached, cell division slows down. The tissues, they do not grow. In fact, the tissues, they start to deteriorate or degenerate, right? We see a lot of degenerative development, especially in the spinal cord, when we enter the older age, or in elderly people, we see a lot of degenerative related diseases. Why? Because the growth is not continuous. Apart from that, you do understand, since the plant tissue, it helps in stationary habits, energy required for maintenance of these tissues is rather low. And for humans, for animals, the energy required for maintenance of these tissues is quite higher. That's the basic difference. And today's interaction is about understanding these plant tissues, which help a plant in growing, which help a plant in maintaining that stationary growth. Let's talk about different plant tissues today. What are the kinds of plant tissues that I find? See, this is the classification of plant tissues. We broadly classify them into two categories: meristematic tissue and permanent tissue. Now, meristematic tissue itself, when it matures, it becomes permanent tissue. Meristematic tissue is responsible for growth, and meristematic tissue is further divided into three different categories. There are two written here, apical and lateral, but there is also intercalary meristem. We'll talk about that. Apart from that, permanent tissue are further divided into simple permanent tissue and complex permanent tissue. Complex permanent tissue, they help in transportation of material. We know plants are autotrophs. They need water, they need minerals, they need oxygen. So transporting of material, it happens through complex permanent tissues. Whereas growth and other photosynthetic activity, it happens mostly through simple permanent tissue. So this is the basic characterization. It will help you to remember from exam perspective. Now let's enter into the tissues, plant tissues, one by one. We'll first talk about meristematic tissue. Now this is a typical meristematic tissue where we find three categorization. I told you meristematic tissues are found in three places. One is at the apex as well as the bottom, that is at the zenith also, at the nadir also. That means at the top it will help grow, and at the bottom also you will see apical meristem. It will help the roots to grow so that they search for water and minerals. So apical meristem is normally found at the apex on either side. This helps in growth, this helps in lengthening of the plant. Apart from apical meristem, we also find intercalary meristem. Now, intercalary meristem is generally found at nodes. Now, you already know, if I draw a simple kind of plant, you will find they have roots, they have stem, they also have different kind of branches, and they have leaves, correct? So, at these internodes, wherever branches are spreading out, wherever leaves are spreading out, wherever fruits are developing, at these internodes, I find intercalary meristem. And there is lateral meristem, which helps in broadening or development of the stem. So there are three kinds of meristematic tissues which are extremely important for growth of a plant, and this you will see continuous development of these tissues. So cells will be continuously added to this, tissues will be developing, and the plant grows eventually into a tree. A tree also continuously grows. What is the difference between these three? As I told you, apical meristem, it is actively located at the tips or at the apex. Now tips we find at the top also, at the bottom also. That means at the top and at the roots, both the sides, growth is going to take place. The intercalary meristem, it helps in dividing cells, especially at the internodes. Internodes means at the leaves, at the branches, at the bases of the leaves, at the bases of the branches, etc. Say, for example, tendrils, thorns, etc. There you will find intercalary meristem. And the lateral meristem, it helps in lateral development of the plant. That means it is going to help in the development or transition from roots to stem. You will find mostly lateral development of stem and the roots. So please remember that the lateral meristem is found in roots also, all the three kinds of meristems. Similarly, in root also, in shoots also, because you know in root system also there are different hairs that go in search of water. So these kind of meristems, they eventually help in initial growth of the plant. So the apical meristem, it aids in height. The lateral meristem, it helps in widening. That means it helps in increasing the girth. And the intercalary meristem, it helps in growth of the internodes. It helps in development of leaves. It helps in development of branches. It helps in development of different nodes connected to the plant. So this is meristematic tissue. Apart from this, we also find epidermis in plants. Now, epidermis is like the outer coating or outer layer of a plant. It's like the skin of the plant. Mostly, classic example can be found out from your leaves, but epidermis is found almost everywhere. If I take a cross section of a stem, you can see here the outer layer is cuticle, which is basically a composition of dead cells for protection of plant. But as soon as I enter the next layer, this is the epidermis. I can simply give an analogy that epidermis is like the skin of the plant. Now, when I enter a little inside, when I do a cross section and I'm reaching towards the middle, I find different kinds of tissues. Now you will see epidermis. Then you will see simple permanent tissue. Then in the middle, you will see complex permanent tissues. You can see some of the examples: Collenchyma, Parenchyma, Phloem, Xylem. We'll talk about all these. But right now, we'll discuss about this epidermis. Now, epidermis, what is the help of this, or why is it needed? Epidermis is the outermost layer of plant cells. It is found out on stem also, on leaves also. Classically, we'll take example of leaves and we'll talk about epidermis from the perspective of leaves. Epidermis is usually a single layer, is usually a single layer. Sometimes it can be two layers also. This is a classical leaf. Now, I told you on the leaf, the outer protective layer is called as cuticle, right? Now, as soon as we enter inside, we will find just below the cuticle epidermis. Many times leaves can have upper epidermis and lower epidermis, and within these you will find the mesophyll cells. Mesophyll cells have chloroplasts in it, which basically help in photosynthesis. You do know C3 photosynthesis, C4 photosynthesis, they take place in mesophyll. Why? Because mesophyll has chloroplast in it, and chloroplast contains chlorophyll, which aids in photosynthesis. Although it's written here, many a times epidermis is usually a single layer, but it can differ. In leaves, you can see different layers also: upper epidermis, lower epidermis. Then in between, you can also find mesophyll cells. Along with it, epidermal cells can also be found on roots. Now, in roots, they have a typical function. In roots, they have a function. They have a development. They bear long hair-like structure on the root so that the root seeks water. If the root is seeking water, the hair or the epidermis is going to increase the surface area on the root so that more and more water and more minerals are caught by the plant roots. All right. Now, epidermis basically protects against water loss. I gave you example here from the leaves, and if you look at the leaf, you know the epidermis's job are multiple. Its functions are multiple. First of all, it tries to protect the plant from water loss. It also regulates in the gas exchange. We know for photosynthesis, plant requires carbon dioxide. It releases oxygen. That means gas exchange has to take place. And for that gas exchange, epidermis helps. It also helps in secreting certain metabolic compounds. And in roots, especially, it helps in absorbing water and mineral nutrients. It also helps many plant roots to excrete also. And we see that there are a lot of adaptations that happen in the epidermis depending on the environment in which the plant is developing. For example, in a forest area, we do have epidermal cells on the plant leaves, especially having some sort of a waxy or a water resistant layer on the outer surface. You must have observed this. Now, next time when you look at a plant, a tree, simply take a leaf and you will see a waxy layer on that leaf. Why is it? To protect it from water loss by excessive transpiration, to also protect it from different insects, to also protect it from different microbes. All right. So it basically protects from parasitic fungi, from mechanical injury to the leaf also. And since epidermis are tissues which are made up of cells, you will very seldom find that there is any sort of intercellular spaces. There are no intercellular spaces in the epidermis. It is very closely attached. When we go to a desert, we call them xerophytes. In xerophytes, plant which live in very dry habitats, what happens is the epidermis, it develops a very thick waxy coating. This kind of waxy coating is found on almost all the plants, but in deserts, very thick waxy coating is found out of cutin. Now, this is responsible again to reduce the transpiration losses. In many aquatic plants or hydrophytes, we call them, in hydrophytes, we find some sort of a different development in epidermis. Now, when we look at epidermis, this is the epidermal layer, upper epidermal layer, lower epidermal layer. In between, you can find mesophyll cells, and below that you will find stomata or stoma. Now, this helps in gas exchange. This is the entire layer of epidermis itself, upper, lower epidermis, and you do have the stomata. All right. Now, when you look at the hydrophytes, you will find in hydrophytes, stomata are on the opposite side. Why? Because they are submerged in water itself. For gas exchange, the stomata would be present on more and more stomata would be present on the upper side. Apart from that, epidermis also harbors the stomata cells. The stomata cells are called as guard cells. If you do a cross section of a leaf, you will find in the epidermal layer itself, you will find a pair of cells, something like this, bean shaped or kidney shaped, right? Two bean shaped paired cells are found. These cells are called guard cells. Now, these guard cells together, they form stomata, and stomata is responsible for transfer of water, that is transpiration happens through the stomata itself, gas exchange happens through the stomata itself, meaning the plant takes in carbon dioxide via stomata, it leaves oxygen via stomata, it also leaves excess water through transmission by stomata. That means the epidermis is also responsible for maintaining the stomatal functions. And as I told you, depending on the environment, depending on the ecosystem, the stomata in most of the desert plants, they remain closed during the daytime because they do not want to lose the water. Whereas in hydrophytes, stomata is always open because the water availability is very, very high. So based on the ecosystem, you can find the adaptation of epidermis in different kinds of plants. All right. So this is about the meristematic tissue. Meristematic tissue, we discussed apical, intercalary, lateral, and we discussed about epidermis. Let's move on towards the permanent tissues. Now, I told you in permanent tissue, we find two kinds of categorization. Permanent tissue are of two types. One is simple permanent tissue, the other one is complex permanent tissue. Now, what is the meaning, first of all, of this permanent tissue? Please remember, permanent tissue are tissues wherein the cells, they lose the ability to further divide. That means they are mature kind of cells or a combination of mature cells that lose the ability of further division. They are permanent. They have some specific function which they keep on performing. And many, especially the complex permanent tissues, they are composed of dead tissues itself. And that is why you need to understand, when I talk about permanent tissues, where do they come from? They actually come from meristematic tissue itself. As the plant matures, as the plant develops, many meristematic tissues, they transform into permanent tissues. Permanent tissues, simple and complex. Let's first talk about simple permanent tissues. Now, simple permanent tissues are of three types. You might find these words a little complicated, but I hope you will remember these. There are three simple permanent tissues: Parenchyma, Collenchyma, and Sclerenchyma. Now, to remember these, whenever you go out next time, when you watch a tree, try to find out or try to categorize the tissues or cells by looking at them, right? So, Parenchyma, Collenchyma, and Sclerenchyma. The structure of these tissues is something like this. In the Parenchyma tissue, there are a lot of intercellular spaces. In the Collenchyma tissue, there are seldom any kind of spaces. They are very tightly bound and mostly they are arranged in a cylindrical form. Both Parenchyma and Collenchyma, they are mostly in form of cylindrical structure or cylindrical form itself, but try to realize that there are a lot of intercellular spaces in the Parenchyma tissue, but in Collenchyma, they are a little less. And Sclerenchyma, please remember, when I say Sclerenchyma, they are nothing but tightly bound dead tissues of the plant. Let's look at some more details of this. When I talk about Parenchyma, I told you Parenchyma tissue is made up of living cells. Remember, this is made up of living cells. They may vary from plant to plant, right? Depending on the morphology and physiology of the plant, the Parenchyma may vary. For example, in hydrophytes, we find Parenchyma a lot as Erenchyma. Why? Because in these tissues or in these cells, a lot of air is held. Why? Because I want the plant to be floating over the water. Similarly, in many of the plants, Parenchyma, it appears as Sclerenchyma, meaning these Parenchyma tissues or Parenchyma cells, they will be having chloroplast, and once they have chloroplast, that means there is chlorophyll in it. They help in photosynthesis. So the job of Parenchyma cells is varied depending on the plants, but they act as a means of storage of food and water, many times storage of even gases, especially in the hydrophytes. Parenchyma cells, living cells, Parenchyma, Sclerenchyma, the categorization of that. Apart from that, we have Collenchyma. Now, Collenchyma are mostly living cells, photosynthetic cells. They have protoplasts in them, and if you look at them, or if you look at them in the microscope, you will find them more in the cylindrical form, and they help in the growth. They help in the growth of height of the plants. Collenchyma tissues can be seen mostly in young stems, and in these young stems, many of the Collenchyma cells, they have chloroplast in them. They do undergo photosynthesis. All right. And please remember, the difference between Parenchyma cells and Collenchyma is that in Collenchyma, they do not have too much of intercellular space in them. These Collenchyma cells, they also provide a lot of assistance to young herbaceous parts of the plant. When the plant is very young in the herb form, then Collenchyma cells are more and more, it provides stability to it. And as the tissues mature, as the growth takes place, we reach into Sclerenchyma. Sclerenchyma tissues are more mature, and please remember, they have secondary cell walls which are very usually thick and composed of lignin. And most of the Sclerenchyma cells, they are non-living or dead cells. So that is why Sclerenchyma are non-living dead tissues. They can be in form of fibers, they can be in form of sclerids, or they can be in form of trachea, that means vessels. We'll discuss about these also when we move into the complex permanent tissue. Sclerenchyma fibers can be seen, especially in composition of xylem itself. These sclerids are normally found, when you take a seed, is there an outer coating outside it? Yes, to protect the seed. It is mostly made up of these Sclerenchyma tissues or Sclerenchyma cells. Most of the seed coats or fibers, or you can give example of coconut. On coconut there are a lot of fibers, and most of those fibers are dried Sclerenchyma fibers. So Sclerenchyma, dead cells, fibers, sclerids, or vessels. Vessels meaning long tubular structures can be formed, and when these tubular structures are formed on both the sides, these are dead cells. These are dead cells or dead tissues, Sclerenchyma, which help in transport. They may form these trachea, or they may form these pipe-like structures for both xylem and phloem. Now let's look at the differences. As I told you, Parenchyma, please remember, they are the soft part in the plant. Sclerenchyma, they are the mature hard part, mostly dead. Remember, Parenchyma are non-specialized, unspecialized cells, whereas Collenchyma are specialized cells, living cells. Both of these, they are living cells. If you look at these specializations, Sclerenchyma is for protection. Collenchyma, there are a lot of chloroplasts in it. That means it helps in stability, it helps in photosynthesis as well. They consist of very thin wall. The Parenchyma has very thin wall and a lot of intercellular spaces. The Collenchyma usually has thin cell wall, but Sclerenchyma has thick and a rigid cell wall, and it is made up of dead cells, dead tissue. You will find a lot of lignin in it, whereas in Parenchyma the cell wall is made up of a lot of cellulose. Apart from this, when you look at function wise, Parenchyma has intercellular space in it. Collenchyma has no or very little space, cylindrical shape, stacked together kind of tissues or cells. And here also there is no intercellular space. But please note, Parenchyma is living, Collenchyma is living, but Sclerenchyma, it consists of dead cell when they reach maturity. And the job of all the three is different. The Parenchyma cells, it helps in photosynthesis, it helps in storage. The examples I gave you, Erenchyma, Sclerenchyma. The Collenchyma, they provide mechanical support. In many of the plants, they also undergo photosynthesis. They also help in stretching or growth of the plant. Whereas Sclerenchyma, they help in providing mechanical support and they help in transportation. Why? Because they provide protection to the seeds, they provide protection to the fruits, they set up trachea. That means they create hollow pipe-like structures for transportation of material in the plant. The mature Sclerenchyma. So these are the three kinds of simple permanent tissue. I'll repeat: Parenchyma, Collenchyma, and Sclerenchyma. Now let's move on to complex permanent tissue. Now this is more simpler, right? Simpler in the sense just from the point of view of remembering, because from school days we do know xylem is a pipe which carries water for the plants, phloem food and water, food and other minerals. Yes, so complex permanent tissues are two kinds. One is xylem vessel, the other one is phloem vessel. You do know xylem is a one-way traffic of water, and one-way traffic of water plus the minerals that are absorbed by the plant roots. Whereas phloem is a two-way transport of everything, two-way transport of water, food, storage, mineral, gases, everything. It's a two-way transport of water and nutrients. You can see water and food are transferred through phloem. Now let's talk about these complex permanent tissues of xylem and phloem one by one. First one, complex permanent tissue, xylem. Its main function is what? Its main function is to transport water from roots. It has to reach to the tip of the leaves. Many a times trees can be almost 50, 60, 100 meters height, and it has to reach from the ground level to the top level. So xylem, it transports water. It also transports the minerals that are required for a plant, right? Nitrogen is needed, phosphorus is needed, the other nutrients are needed. So these minerals are taken through the xylem and they are provided in all the leaves or all the parts of the plant. Xylem basically is composed of three different kinds of structures of cell. Xylem tracheids, you must have seen tracheids in Sclerenchyma. Xylem vessels, again trachea of Sclerenchyma, and xylem parenchyma. All right, so xylem, it consists of three constituents: xylem tracheid, xylem vessel, and xylem parenchyma. When we look at the functions of these three, xylem tracheids, as I told you, they are lignified. That means dead cells which form a kind of a conduit. So these are lignified and dead cells which with a bordered pits, so that water and other nutrients can pass through. Since these are tracheids, these are fiber kind of structures, they help in stability of the plant as well. Apart from that, there are xylem vessels. Now these are the Sclerenchyma trachea, the mature trachea, xylem trachea. They are long, tubular, again lignified cell wall. It's like a pipe, and at the end of these there are pipe-like projections or pipe-like opening. And in most of the angiosperms, that means flower-bearing plants, we do find these xylem vessels. They are like openings. They have pits also, so that water can be released everywhere. They also have openings at the ends. Apart from that, there is xylem parenchyma. Now, as by the name itself, you do understand parenchyma are loosely, or there is a lot of intercellular space in these parenchyma cells or parenchyma tissue. And for xylem also, yes, these are made up of living cells. Now, why are they made up of living cells? Because xylem also needs food and water. That means xylem as a tissue, yes, it may be composed of a lot of vessels, tracheids, but xylem also needs, we find a primary xylem and secondary xylem based on the maturity. We'll talk about these in our subsequent classes when we reach class 10, etc. But xylem also needs food and xylem also needs water. That is provided by the xylem parenchyma. All right, so xylem, water and mineral transport. Another complex permanent tissue is phloem. Phloem is responsible for transport of food, transport of water, transport of nutrients, transport of everything actually. So phloem is composed of different kinds of structures or different kinds of entities like sieve tube. You can see a phloem. Phloem has phloem parenchyma. By now you must have guessed what is the job of phloem parenchyma, I hope. There are sieve tubes, there is a sieve plate and different companion cells to it. A xylem is composed of sieve tubes, companion cells, fibers or xylem tracheids, then phloem tracheids and phloem parenchyma. Now, what is the job of these sieve tubes? By the name itself, you can see these are living, but they do not have nucleus at the maturity. Slowly and steadily, nucleus disappears. They are more like a conduit. They are composed of cellulose, which help in transport of water and food. They help in conduction mainly of food material, sieve tubes. And at the end of each sieve tube, there is a sieve plate. That means the food material has to pass from one sieve tube to another sieve tube. Apart from that, there are companion cells. Please remember, companion cells are living cells. These are living cells. They are thin walled. In many of the gymnosperms, these things are not present, and along with sieve tubes and sieve plates, companion cells, they help in transport of food material. Apart from that, there are phloem fibers. Phloem fibers are also called as bast fibers. Now these are mostly dead cells or thick walled cells which provide mechanical support to the plant, mechanical support to the phloem as well. And finally, there is phloem parenchyma. By now you must have understood what is the job of phloem parenchyma. Phloem itself needs food products, and food and water is supplied to phloem by phloem parenchyma. It also it stores a lot of products like mucilage, tannins and resins. All right, so this is about the complex permanent tissue. I hope that you have gotten the clear-cut idea. Let me just give you a small summary kind of a discussion. Plant tissues are divided into meristematic tissue and your permanent tissues. Meristematic tissue itself transformed into, or they develop into, permanent tissues with the growth of the plant. Meristematic tissues are responsible for the growth. You find apical meristem at the apex or at the tip. I can say at the tip. These are responsible for growth. There is lateral meristem, which is responsible for growth of stem. That means widening of the stem. Apart from this, there is one more meristematic tissue. It is called as intercalary, and this is normally found at the different nodes, the development of leaves and branches. On the other side, you have permanent tissues. Now, permanent tissues are further divided into simple ones and complex ones. Simple ones, parenchyma, collenchyma and sclerenchyma. Parenchyma and collenchyma both are composed of living cells or living tissues. Both help in photosynthesis. Sclerenchyma is mostly composed of dead cells. They provide stability or structure to the plant. Apart from that, there are complex permanent tissues, xylem and phloem. Xylem is for water transport. It is one way, water and mineral transport. Phloem is for food and other transport. It is a two-way transport mechanism throughout the plant. It transfers the products that are developed by the photosynthesis. When photosynthesis occurs, the nutrients are used, the energy is transferred, or the food is transferred throughout the plant through the vessel called as phloem. It is a complex permanent tissue. Clear? Right. So this is the first part of our discussion. In our subsequent lecture, we'll talk about animal tissues. That's the end of today's discussion. If you have liked this discussion, if you have any queries, any doubts, if you want to connect with me, you can always reach out to me on this ID @Rahul Sai 222. I do respond on Saturdays and Sundays. If you have any doubt about the prelims to interview initiative, also drop me a message. I will clarify all the things. So I'll see you very soon in the next lecture. Thank you for watching this video. Jai Hind.